What if there was a scientific discovery that helps tie together ancient mythical theology and modern paranormal? What if this discovery is not even new, but instead just overlooked? Well, let's start at the beginning with an intro. You know how we do. A man who had once been shown the vastness of heaven and earth was told by a strange being that, despite his astral travels, he ain't seen nothing yet. The being said, "All mysteries have not yet been revealed to you." He wiped sweat from his forehead and felt a quiver of nerves course through him. He knew it was time to go to the place that this angel simply called the place where no flesh walks. Realizing the irony, he began to walk accompanied by beings of translucent flame that burned but were never consumed and would take on the form of men when necessary to communicate. They took him up to 7 mountains, past infinite winter and darkness, and up through the countless luminaries. Here he witnessed the invisible vaults in which these suns were kept. He saw that in this place, fire flows like water from the mouth of the deep. Although he had been through portals before, this one was different. It seemed to reach to heaven like a throne of sapphire. In the center was an orb of virgin flame, burning but again not consumed. A feeling of awe and dread caused him to hesitate when the beings of invisible flame called out to him, saying, "Enoch, this place is the end of heaven and earth, a prison for the stars and the host of heaven." He went and he trembled. He could not believe his eyes. He could not describe this vision except by way of saying that this place was beyond and without firmament. He saw a mighty sword composed of lightning sting the very cornerstone of the earth, and then realized what was happening and why he was being shown this terrific sight. This was generation. This was realization. This was the place where both stars and earth are born from, a place of pre-creation. This was where reality is made. We grew up under the assumption that the universe is made up of atoms, the only argument being things of concept like ideas and dreams. Well, it turns out that, like many other solid facts in science that tend to break down over time, the universe is only about 1% atomic. 99% of our physical universe is made up of plasma. Plasma is not composed of atoms. It is, loosely speaking, loose particles like charged protons and stray electrons. And it is pretty much everything, making our tangible earthly world quite literally the minority of reality overall. Our biological senses, limited to what we have come to call the black cube, is set up to work with tangible atomic reality for survival here, making no surprise as to the origin of this mix-up. We really have to get outside the box to imagine reality in this different way. Finding this out, one is quick to assume that the plasma that makes up our unseen reality ain't doing much but hovering around lifeless. Again, this is our black cube doing the assuming for us. Professor Robert Temple, along with many scientists currently catching up to the new findings, insists that ordering properties of charged subatomic particles is quite complex. So complex that it dwarfs the neural networks of a brain. It evolves and it makes decisions. Seems unprecedented, but studies have been showing this for a long time now, and just like any other result that would cause Rupert Sheldrake to do a graceful backflip, when we find consciousness outside of ourselves, we often become frightened. Throwing out the scientific method, we say the process was flawed and shelf the findings. A shelf just high enough off the ground that Robert Temple and others with a sharp eye for anomalies can reach up and rehash the shortcomings of the scientists who shake in their boots whenever they find out something that the current textbook just won't fit. Temple has an excellent way of breaking these things down for people like myself to be able to grasp. I'll touch on many of these experiments as we go, but for the time allotted, I'd like to mostly focus on what this all means. But Basically, dusty self-organizing plasmas have been found in many labs to form dissipative structures, like the opposite of entropy. Complex dusty plasmas will find each other, hold memory, reproduce, dance, look around, and even play pranks on some of the more unfortunate scientists who had to hide their very results. That last one I'll try to get to today, but all of which together seem to put the last nail in the coffin of Nail's model of a mechanical universe, as well as open the floodgates to scientifically theological philosophy, if you can imagine those not being an oxymoron, just right for this channel. Now, all this stems from micro levels of plasma that can fit in a tiny laboratory on Earth. So why is Temple's book called A New Science of Heaven? Well, if you have ever celebrated your own isolated hermit-like melancholy by staring up at the moon and feeling alone, well, you don't get to feel that sweet loneliness anymore, pup. Because there has been something looking back this entire time. We now have proof of what has become known as Kordylewski plasma clouds, and this is literally and figuratively a huge deal. Between the Earth and the Moon, absolutely fixed at dual 60-degree angles to the Moon from our planet's point of view, are two gigantic clouds looking right back at us. Discovered in 1961 by astronomer Kordylewski, hence the name, these twin clouds did not make ripples in our scientific community, but 58 years later, the discovery was confirmed and began to pique interest. Interesting indeed, because these self-organizing plasmoids are exactly the same so-called substance as the ones that our friendly yet reluctant scientists found to be self-aware in laboratories. But this is where interesting turns very abruptly into holy moly, what in God's name have we stumbled upon? Because at 9 times the size of Earth each, these two clouds dwarf everything on Earth due to sheer size and computational power. The size alone makes it safe to say that we actually live within a plasma system that happens to have an Earth and a moon. But we are forced to remember that the complexity of these seemingly sentient plasmas have incredible memory patterns due to their particles being parallel to the neurons of a brain. In this case, a gigantic brain. Or if the self-awareness bothers you, a gigantic computer, but to say the least. I am not being coy or metaphorical when I say that the immensity of these plasmoids' computational power is enough to keep track of every single thing that has ever happened on Earth, down to the microscopic biological processes. To put this into perspective, our finest AI systems can study algorithmic patterns and loosely predict the future. It can create images based off of script and even give poignant advice. Neat. But these plasmatic clouds are trillions upon trillions of times more powerful than any of that. And unlike our AI, shows signs of true sentience. Whoa. Robert Temple has this to say about it. If the Kordylewski plasma clouds are examples of inorganic life that has existed for billions of years, they may have had a role in forming this planet throughout its long cosmic history. They may even have helped create organic life. Clearly, these ideas open up vast new speculation on the origins of the cosmos and the role of intelligence within it. I will be arguing that life in its basic state is inorganic and is not made up of atomic matter. I suggest that it is made out of pre-atomic matter, namely plasma. Thus, I am suggesting that we and all living things in the universe, whether organic or inorganic, arise from this plasma, and that the organic state is secondary to our fundamental nature as plasma beings. I will also show that as well as being very new, these ideas are also, in another sense, very old. Ancient religions and philosophers in the classical world, including Aristotle, formulated very similar ideas. I know what you're thinking. Aristotle was wrong about a lot, sure, but his science was entwined with philosophy. The grand scale of his work was that there is more to the universe than we can see, and with that, he nailed it, despite being flawed in the details. On that note, if we only study things that are already confirmed, we are just running in circles. And if we, likewise, only study what is tangibly real, then by definition, we will be missing out on seeing anything else. Sentience is a mystery that can't be seen, and it runs the world, perhaps even the universe. And that little perhaps thrown in there can probably be thrown out. London scientist William Crookes was bold enough to study plasmatic sentience because at the time, well, he didn't know any better. That's sarcasm. You wearing tall shoes?
What?
Why are you wearing tall shoes?
I'm not.
Those are tall shoes.
Like my sole, like my foot is going.
Oh, I see. It just looks like it.
The soles are made out of recycled other shoes.
Is that so? Environmentally friendly tennis shoes. Between that and working with flowers, you are uber organic today. He coined the term fourth state of matter, kinda making him our plasma daddy. And this is old school and certainly no amateur science. He discovered helium and thallium in the 1800s and has since been a named staple to science. But it was the discovery of what he called radiant matter that we now call plasma that caused Crookes to later in life become infatuated with the existence of a spirit world. Unlike many other things in nature, he found that cathode rays of electrons could travel in straight lines. This was huge. And don't tell Terrence Howard he is really out here shaking things up. But like Nikola Tesla and many other misunderstood names stapled to science, Crookes' work evolved to involve spiritual matters, and he was not shy about it. I would say that this causes them to be ahead of their time, but it seems to me that we have de-evolved into strict material science and are just now realizing what was once forgotten, now that those who fund the research are starting to realize that they cannot weaponize it. Okay, let's keep it reeled in. In 1986, it was Hiroyuki Ikezi, who predicted that plasma could take on crystalline formations. As we know, crystals are what we use in modern tech to store information and is necessary in long-distance communication. Like our Kordylewski clouds, this is memory. And in a paper by another name that I cannot pronounce, Saitovich, we learn about plasmas using crystalline formations to form helical structures like DNA. Complex plasmas may naturally self-organize themselves into stable, interacting helical structures that exhibit features normally attributed to organic living matter. Each helical string, composed of solid microparticles, is topologically and dynamically controlled by plasma fluxes leading to the particle charging. These interacting complex structures exhibit thermodynamic and evolutionary features thought to be peculiar only to living matter. I don't want to hear any comments about my pronunciation of peculiar. Capable of reproducing and maintaining itself, principles used to define life. The well-known problem in explaining the origin of life is that the complexity of living creatures is so high that the time necessary to form the simplest organic living structures is, or seems, too large compared to the age of the Earth. Can faster evolution rates be achieved for non-organic structures, in particular in space consisting of mostly plasmas, i.e. of natural components spread almost everywhere in the universe? This should be taken into account for formulation of a new SETI-like program, not only on astrophysical observations, but also on planned new laboratory experiments. One should be faced with the possibility of resolving the low rate of evolution of organic life by investigating the possibility that inorganic life invents the organic life. Robert Temple chimes in at this point. After all, who needs little green men when you've got gigantic intelligent clouds on your doorstep, which are billions of times more intelligent than any green man ever could be, billions of years older than any possible organic life form, and the entities who must in effect be the true masters of the universe. It goes on to hypothesize what it is that this kind of living entity would eat and consume. It wouldn't be matter. Things that are made up of matter require the consuming of matter. But everything living consumes something, and this, as startling as it is to speculate, makes me wonder about the Gnostic theories and the lost and or removed books of the Bible. And frankly, in the newish term we have, loosh, comes to mind. Gnostic stuff is coming up, just hold on a minute. And damn it, if we open up that can of beans, then I feel like I need to revisit many of my notes on prior videos about non-flesh beings that have been influencing our world for thousands of years and today. Many people have often felt a sense of being observed throughout philosophical history, between theories of us living in a zoo planet or our entire reality being parallel to a petri dish that is studied by higher life forms, to biological limitations seemingly put on us and transcending those limitations through Zen and other spiritual practices. What if we were all onto something? And material science has been running from the implications ever since. Not consciously running, of course, but you have noticed that when shit gets weird, material science shuts it down like, yo, we don't want to know. There are those who feel like we live within a closed system and will die on that hill despite the enormity of physical evidence. What if they are, in a spiritual or dimensional sense, correct? Is it possible that our gut intuition is that much wiser than our scientific instruments? Well, out of the two, only one of those has technological limitations. We are a fascinating species, namely because of our free will and creative nature. We don't see activity like this anywhere else in nature. How interesting we must be to a possible sidereal anthropologist, so to speak. Think about this. We have power-hungry psychopaths that want to control the world. And if we are honest, it is that same spark of insanity that can be used for creativity in the arts. This has been called divine madness. This instability in the human psyche that makes us such a dangerous and violent and destructive species can be compared to the same driving force that makes us unique, intelligent, musical, creative, and most importantly, have free will, a blessing and a curse. What an ironic trade-off. Our behavior would be a high priority of study for any life form outside of our visible reality to see what happens and possibly even learn from us itself. What if they or it wants to find out if we can make this work without intervention, to see if we can create a model of world where we can have powerful creative free will without the destructive byproduct of greed and hate. This would absolutely send a ripple of change and opportunity throughout the cosmos, seen and unseen. The concept of the fate of the cosmos being up to us has been a mainstay in the majority of religious writings and Gnostic or Zen thinking. But along with that, we might be subject to it. That's the catch. Because another mainstay in all religious philosophy is the concept of all humanity being wiped out by some flood or other natural disaster because of what was going on here on Earth. whether it be from our sinful behavior or an outbreak of giants from Nephilim tainting the process of Earth's evolution, it always seems a similar story. The gods or God sends a catastrophe to reset the entire deal. And here is where things become very sobering to contemplate. In our last video, Plasma Apocalypse, we looked at ample evidence that the Younger Dryas catastrophe event that reset the memory of humanity may not have been from a comet or a meteor after all, but instead, as the title suggests, induced by cosmic plasma. Could it be that some of the ancient lore that we have been poring over might finally have a scientifically identifiable personage? I mean, what is going on here? I don't know, but let's reel it in again and get back to some of our research for a bit. All right, so the same book here, A New Science of Heaven, Temple writes this bold statement in regard to the findings that plasma is self-organizing, seemingly needless of an origin like our known biological life. By this means, plasma people can exist who are imperceptible to the optical nerves of the physical people who are not made of plasma but of flesh and blood. Because we are incapable of directly perceiving the plasma people, we do not know that they are there. And furthermore, they may be of such diffuse matter that they can pass through our dense physical matter and emerge intact. Scientists know that ball lightning does this. Spiritual beings such as angels are also said to have this capability. The internal structures of the two clouds, or Kordylewski clouds, could be so complex and at such a vast scale, they surpass any possible human knowledge at this time. The storage capacity for information would easily include the ability to retain full knowledge. Everyone who has ever lived will be recorded. The presiding consciousness, or what psychologists call the executive ego states of the clouds, will have personalities so alien from our own that we cannot conceive of them. Now, all of a sudden, we are using the word people and talking about your personal behavior, even the hidden sets being recorded. And this has religious doctrine written all over it. If you want the pun, then it's intended. And why not? I mean, nature begins with plasma. It was here first, and we have no idea where it came from or why it emerges independently. It was just here first. Then the cooling of the plasma became gas. Cooling of the gas became liquid. Cooling of the liquid becomes matter. All of which, of course, relative to their own composition and makeup. So really, plasma is not a fourth state of matter. It is the mother of all three typical states of matter. And to my Buddha friends out there, from the one comes the three, and from the three comes all things. We getting deep here. There are peeps still thinking that ball lightning doesn't exist, and simultaneously those who claim that UFOs can be explained away by ball lightning, the latter of which now raises so many more questions about Travis Walton, and I'll try to get to that. Hey, quit it. But ball lightning is real, and not just my name on OnlyFans. It can be artificially created in a lab, as George Richmond found out in 1753 when it literally killed him. And now I suspect foul play. Ball lightning does not seem to care about our precious solid matter. It passes right through solid walls, brick walls, the metal of an airplane, anything solid except for seemingly crystalline structures. Ball lightning does not care about wind direction or gravity either. It has been found to pretty much go where it pleases. In both eyewitness cases from nature and in lab experiments, ball lightning will mosey around curiously and take right-angle turns, accelerate as if there is no wind at all. It'll stroll down the aisle of a 747 jetliner to the horror of all passengers on board, and and etc. It certainly seems to have a life of its own, as if it were a fractal broken off of the mother plasmoid sent to snoop around here on Earth. This has interesting mythological parallels. People often quote Moses as having spoke to God through a burning bush. Might be a bit of a Mandela effect here, but in older Bibles it says that an angel of the Lord spoke to Moses through what was like a burning bush. Temple points out that this was not a literal bush, but a plasmoid that the authors back then just didn't have a word for. When Moses approached the burning bush, the actual Lord calls out that he stop and not get too close to the glowing orb. Now, I have always felt like this story was a parable for the DMT that comes from the acacia bush, which is so frequently mentioned in scriptures and myth, considering that it burned but didn't consume itself. I feel like that is meant to represent the alchemical transmutation, extracting the powerful hallucinogen within it. But if Temple is correct, and this was a sort of ball lightning, this does in fact bring up Travis Walton. As we know, Travis was not sought after to be abducted. He was curious, in the wrong place at the wrong time. He and his co-workers all saw the glowing orb, and Travis had the balls to approach it. But this time, the Lord didn't call out, as, well, I suppose that he wasn't expected that day, and there was an unfortunate discharge that zapped him, almost killing him. The abduction, he realized later, was the beings responsible for this mishap attempting to save his life. It should go without saying at this point that this whole plasma subject is certainly tying a lot of mysteries together, while at the same time raising so many more questions. For example, in our last video, we talked about vitrification, being that very powerful lightning can turn sand or stone into a kind of glass. This is interesting beyond the vitrified forts that we spoke of in that video. Many of us remember the surprising archaeological findings in the Red Sea that seem to indicate a literal happening there involving our friend Moses once again. But down the center of the bottom, we have found vitrified earth materials. That's 2 counts of possible plasma interactions with Moses, all of which unfortunately must remain in the realm of speculation, as many Bibles seem to differ greatly. Temple brings us back to the UFO subject though, considering that all of the above observations of ball lightning can easily be applied to UFOs. Roughly speaking, that our Kordaluski clouds, being sentient, might be sending drones to observe us like they're, a mothership. And considering a concept that would absolutely tickle our friend Jacques Vallée, these self-organizing particles would have no issue taking on the form of mechanical devices. This shape-shifting form of cloaking would certainly catapult us into a frenzy of conspiracy about people from space, making us completely miss the point of the UFO phenomenon. And in that case, a concept that would equally tickle Grandpa Carl, as we have covered. And I personally am tickled knowing that there is at least a few of you out there watching who completely skipped my whole UFO and alien abduction series, who are now like, oh shit, I gotta go back and give those a watch. Because, well, like I said in those videos, if you study Gnosticism and you dismiss this, you've missed the point. But nevertheless, ball lightning is plasma. But when we consider ball lightning, like the name naively suggests, we consider it to be like lightning, random and sporadic. But like Temple says, we shouldn't take what is familiar to us in daily life as the basis for trying to understand the universe, as that gives us a wholly distorted picture of reality. It should be noted that this plasma may be sentient, but it should not be confused with being consciousness itself. It seems to have the gift of consciousness, but its world is simply too alien to be perceived from our cube. The narrow spectrum of light that our eyes pick up on can't detect an invisible world, or one that we might call the other side. We always hear about the breakthroughs announced by CERN, about entities and so-called ghosts that have been detected when breaking down the fabric of reality in the particle accelerator. Workers at CERN have claimed to communicate, albeit in a very strange way, with some kind of extra-dimensional life form. It takes big, expensive equipment to do this. That is, if we ourselves are disconnected, that is. The Tibetan Book of the Dead frequently mentions the clear light. So do various other Eastern manuscripts like the Upanishads and the Gitas. There are several references to strange orbs of light throughout the Gnostic Gospels as well. And speaking of the Gnostics, a particular sect of Gnostics called the Marcosians spoke of two gigantic superhuman beings that lived in the sky on either side of the moon. And if you're thinking of the Kordaluski clouds, yes, we are on the same page, because this seems beyond coincidence. What is even more startling is what they called one of these beings. It was referred to by the name Metatron, the same being that is believed to be the angel of the Lord that spoke to Moses through the likeness of a burning bush. Let's go back to that for a moment, because perhaps Moses picked up a couple tricks from Enoch, considering that, well, he's involved now. I found this little nugget in the much overlooked backyard section of the Book of Enoch. I saw there something like an invisible cloud, for by reason of its depth I could not overlook it. And I saw a flame of fire blazing brightly, and things like shining mountains circling and sweeping to and from. Despite the language barriers and differing cultures, could it be possible that all these traditions are telling us about the same thing? After all, before we even had these ancient writings, before writing at all, we have the squatting man archetype carved into stone all over the world by differing cultures without contact. And these very petroglyphs seem to be pointing directly to cosmic plasma. In all cases, it seems to be communicating with the people directly involved. And as Temple puts it, it seems that ancient seers were able to perceive clearly what we are only now able to demonstrate scientifically and recreate in advanced modern laboratories. This fits quite well with the growing theory that very ancient people were once very much more advanced than us, but the reason we don't have ample evidence of this is because their technology was more harmonious with the earth and nature, and now it seems with this plasma. This technology would have been of the spirit and not based in carbon like we have today. Therefore, disheartening as it is, our material tech has detached us from this ancient and sacred communion. Perhaps ancient peoples and shamans understood plasma sentience better than we do today, and we use their lack of unnecessary scientific jargon as an excuse to think that we have a superior understanding. Perhaps it is us that is beyond the pale when it comes to understanding this seemingly cornerstone of reality. Because if we ignore plasma, we are ignoring the center source that gives birth to all physical matter. If we want to better understand our world, we should be studying what gives birth to it. We should be studying its mother. Philoponus of Alexandria wrote, "Beyond the soul is another kind of body that is forever attached, which is radiance or starlight. It forever keeps its radiant body, which is of an everlasting nature." A Gnostic treatise called Apocalypse of Adam says that before Adam was thrown out of the garden, he had gone about in a radiant and glowing condition, and that he would return to the divine regions in the form of clouds of great light. Of course, outside the garden, he became bound to the tangible pain body that we are all familiar with today. The Marcionese text states that the third shape of the soul is spherical, but men who become too attached to earth cease to radiate light and go dark like the fallen angels. Paraphrase of Shem mentions throughout its codex garments of light, luminous fire spirits, powers of restless fire, exalted clouds of power, and orbs of silent majestic light, etc. And we know about the Apocrypha of John, where it reads that Sophia hid Yaldabaoth, the creator of physical matter, inside a great luminous cloud. Later, Aristotle insisted that when we die, our spirit, through Pneuma, can return to the world of the fifth element. But before any of this, in ancient Egypt, Ptah was said to have created the world by his speech, which was made of light moving into a cavern or a womb like a fluid. Perhaps the obscure world of hieroglyphics might make more sense if we stop assuming them to be religious superstition and compare them to the quantum world that they certainly seem to have somehow been aware of. For example, the symbol of the Ankh deeply resembles a device of today that Winston Harper called the button source, a mechanism that projects plasmoids to study how they behave. Nevertheless, the OG Egyptians used the Ankh to communicate with something invisible to us, and we'll come back to that possible connection in the video. But the list goes on, and we haven't even touched the Eastern Vedic text of striking similarity. We have a couple of ways we can look at this list from today's perspective. One, that all ancient people from all time periods, from all corners of the earth, have been debunked by modern material science about these strange, almost alien descriptions. Or two, that we have been ignoring a branch of science that proves them exactly correct, but under very different terminology. We might just be playing word games to create false categories. For example, ancient people said that the Great Flood was caused by God, but modern science is finding out it was caused by a solar flare. And right in the middle, we have the Egyptian personification called Ra. Just by unifying those opposites comes clarity to a confusing subject, but first we gotta acknowledge the words of others as wise. We need to face this fact: mythology is half-cocked without science, and likewise, science without mythology is even more unstable. So when it comes to the heavy-hitting subjects like birth and death, we better take heed as to what both sides of the fence have in common before we come to any conclusions whatsoever. The strange orbs of fluid light from the so-called other side perceived by the ancient mystics must have a scientific equivalent today. And thanks to bold, intuitive, and fearless minds like Robert Temple, Judy K. King, Robert Schock, and Rupert Sheldrake, we might have new terminology that bridges the gap. A new science of heaven. This is the strange and unseen world of plasma sentience. In the late 1800s, everyone wanted to talk to their dead grandpa, paving the way for hoaxers to grab for easy money. Charlatans would hide cheese paper in their butts or in their vaginas, and through sleight of hand produce the ectoplasm of deceased loved ones at some kind of dark seance. Many of them got busted, and we laugh about it today. So that's the last nail in the coffin on this subject, and the end of our show. Goodbye, guys. Okay, now that it's just us here, let me illustrate a point that many of you might have already caught. Skeptics and material science often ignores the study of things that hoaxers have been caught perpetuating. They see the scam and they call it debunked because, well, everyone is super afraid of being seen as a secondhand fool. This would be like camping in an area that's got bears, seeing some bear tracks and then finding out that your buddy Sean has quite a sense of humor and brought with him a little bear footprint blueprint cookie cutter thingy as a joke. And now that you know that he snuck out in the night and hoaxed those bear tracks, y'all leave food out knowing damn well that there are no bears. This is a huge mistake to overlook, because there might be. Look closer and you find bear shit in the woods, and Sean would probably not go that far. Probably. Yes, he would. Our last video, Science of Heaven, laid out the evidence of the Cordillera clouds that seem to be aware of not only themselves, but of us, as they match the highly structured crystalline form of much smaller, self-organizing dusty plasmas that have been studied in labs. Plasmas that resemble the multidimensional life form that we call neurons, a brain. For this episode, we should remember that the computational power of such a complex structure as these Cordy clouds dwarfs that of a human brain or any AI here on Earth. These clouds have been here for billions of years, a likely estimate, and can store all information contained in our solar system, yet they seem obviously interested in the Earth and Moon system, which is their home. We should be clear, though, that despite the evidence of sentient consciousness, we do not know if these clouds have emotions or free will. They might, but so far we only have evidence of intelligence, kind of reminding us of the archons of Gnostic lore that can imitate and store information but are jealous of human activity, which is a gift from the divine, but we'll come back to that. We also learned that 99% of the universe is not atomic, but plasmatic, a scientific certainty that is somehow still not widely known. That brings us to a very fringe idea that hovers mostly in the realm of sci-fi, where we might start to ask ourselves where the idea for sci-fi even comes from in the first place. Because if 99% of the universe is plasma, that means that 99% of you is plasma as well. As above, so below, babe. Thus, we have been forced to acknowledge the possible real existence of what has been called ectoplasma. If ectoplasma is animate or sentient, and physical matter is not, as far as we can tell, is it safe to speculate that what animates life in a human body is the plasma that inhabits it while we are alive? And does it leave at death? We all remember the study in 1907 when Duncan McDougall, MD, performed a series of extraordinary experiments on dying patients. He showed his work on 6 cases where he was able to weigh the patients at the moment of their death, and they lost weight. Not much weight, but enough to get your girl to update her profile picture on Instacart. What many people don't know is that they had animals as well. Dr. H.B. James writes this: "Let me add that I have repeated them with animals, and there too Crook's results are correct. There is always a sharp drop, but its extent is very much less than in man. Such are the facts. The interpretation, of course, admits of argument." So, per capita, less weight is lost in animals, because we people got a big fat soul. But this would indicate that a larger consciousness adds to this weight. And all of a sudden, I'm reminded of stories of ancient Zen masters who would die and become light as a feather. I wonder if this, like many allegorical interpretations, is an exaggeration of this same process. Skeptics will say that this experiment is not evidence because it cannot be repeated. That is plain false. The fact is that no one has yet tried to repeat it. I mean, we got reputations to maintain here, guys. Perhaps it would behoove them to create an experiment to debunk it, if that's the proper motivation needed to find out. If you can prove it wrong, then do it. I mean, remember when outer space was just an empty void, like just the other day? And we now know that there's a great deal of activity that we just can't see. Well, funny story. Swiss astronomer Fritz Zwicky told us this back in 1933, and his colleagues blacklisted him, to say the least. They went as far as to write letters to every single publisher out at the time, warning them not to print his work. We now know that this was to maintain the established theory that kept them in business. However, when the findings began pouring in, as they typically do with time, instead of apologizing to Zwicky, his colleagues insisted that they knew he was right all along. Don't ever think that science or any other field is above social drama. It also turns out that the censorship of Zwicky's findings were completely illegal, but no one was held accountable. I don't know, but yeah, let's reel it in. The U.S. defense establishment hired Winston Bostick to find out how plasma would react when fired into magnetic fields. The interactions of plasmoids and magnetism could yield great weapons, after all. But unknown to Bostick at the time, he would make a gigantic scientific discovery that nobody expected. Results that the military would have to hide, and they remained hidden for a long time. But you can't hide from professional snoops like Robert Temple, because he went through what he called impossible lengths to find these papers. Papers of which surprised Temple, even though they backed up his own hypothesis. Because it turns out, if you try to weaponize plasma, plasma just does not want to cooperate. For the job, Bostick invented what he called a button source, but it's basically a plasma gun. As the plasma ejected from the rod, it would take on this unexpected torus shape. So right off the bat, it was weird. At the time, it was not conceivable that non-atomic particles could organize like this, but it was known that the torus shape was closely related to all living things. See our Cosmic Egg video for all that jazz. But for right now, imagine shooting gravel out of a cannon and then watching it self-organize into donuts. That's how surprised they were. But the real show happened when the plasma left the button source to act on its own. The discovery that bursts of plasma were not merely shapeless blobs, but were tori, was bizarre enough. But things got much, much stranger than that. In his article, Bostick described these features. Interesting and unexpected effects are produced when two plasmoids are projected at one another across a magnetic field. For example, an interaction that looks like an elastic collision of two billiard balls. These effects become even more spectacular when four sources instead of two are employed. Robert adds to this. They seemed to be behaving as living entities. We appear to be dealing with bodies which have strong powers of self-organization and preservation. Plasmoids seem to seek each other out, unerringly. Not only do we have hunting plasmoids, we even have mating ones. After the union of two plasmoids has been accomplished, the angular momentum will wind them up into a spiral. The resulting plasma and magnetic configuration then seems to be stable. It is astonishing that such bizarre configuration of plasma and magnetic fields should appear to be stable. No theoretician known to the author has a prior dream of such a configuration. Bostick became so excited by this that he also reverted to an earlier concern with galaxy formation and wrote, "It is possible to apply the knowledge gained concerning the nature of plasmoids to a hypothesized process of galaxy formation. The behavior of charged plasma and plasmoids may be similar at all scales of size, from these tiny plasmoids in his laboratory to the scale of entire galaxies in space." The plasmoids did their own thing, and the scientists felt frankly laughed at. This infuriated the military, of course, hence the non-disclosure, but they reacted the same way that you would react if you intended to play a game of pool, but when you struck the first ball, it got up and woke the other balls on the table, and they left the weird green carpet thing that I can't think of the name of and danced around the room. That game of pool for you would be over, and you might even think twice before telling your friends about it. Temple's book, A New Science of Heaven, describes many other experiments like this. The plasmas cannot be contained, for example. Even with copper shields and thick, sturdy walls, the dancing plasmoids would pass right through them and just leave. In a rather comical experiment, plasmas were found to give birth to their own dust. And why is this comical? Well, these labs are clean rooms. Basically, if any dust or bacteria is found, you gotta scrap the whole experiment and start over. So each time they almost achieved some kind of result that could be recorded, they found dust. They didn't know or even conceive that plasma could do this, much less choose when to do it, because time and time again, it would happen at the worst possible times, under all kinds of different controls, seemingly to aggravate the researchers, until finally they caught it giving birth to its own dust, which turns turns out in itself to be a breakthrough discovery, which is good for what we need as speculators. What is most bizarre is that the strange misbehavior of the plasmas is not consistent across labs. The mischief is specific to each experiment, seemingly in the goal of retarding the desired result of each particular study. Easy now, it's in the text. Free and out in the open, though, what we might call free-range plasma has been found to feed on younger, fresh plasmoids and be literally nourished. They tend to swarm like microbial beings and even take on the form of intricate helical structures as if practicing to make DNA. So it seems that if you want to study something's behavior, it might be best to do so in its natural environment. Otherwise, it'll act weird or fight back. In the defense of the scientists, they didn't know that it was alive in the first place. What makes this downright frightening and somewhat exciting is that if these things are alive, as the data shows, then they have, and I hesitate to say, superpowers by every definition. Just like we have seen in myths describing jinn, sprites, daemons, or even the way that the paranormal world describes UFOs and alien beings. The way these plasmas act can be described the same way that we do for ghosts. The further suggestion is that when we die, because our physical body has worn out, our plasma body may detach from our physical body and abandon it to death. We might be said to continue to exist as plasmatic beings made of non-atomic matter. This leads to the concept of bioplasma beings existing without physical bodies, and I suggest that this is what is often referred to as the other world. Traditionally, it has been called the spiritual world. Upon the assumption that it must be wholly immaterial, it was assumed that the body and spirit were entirely separate, one being material and the other one being entirely non-material. This is the prime fallacy of our Western civilization. It is not a fallacy that was ever traditionally adopted by the Chinese. The Zen guys knew. In mythologies and ancient spiritual sects, birth and death is associated with light. Well, again, we have an affirmative with science. We have captured footage of original conception in the womb and found that when the sperm and the egg become one, a flash of light is emitted. Scientists say it's a flash of zinc. Hippies say it's the spirit entering the body. And here we all are watching them fight over which one it is, knowing that, per usual on this channel, it's probably both. And don't start in the comments with that same old usual argument about that thing, okay? Let's not jump to fight and convince mode over a clip. I mean, it really gets us nowhere.
And the treatise on resurrection interprets 1 Corinthians 15, Paul's teaching on resurrection. But Paul did not see Jesus come out of the grave. Paul did not touch him. Paul never talks that way. Paul says, there I was, traveling to Syria. And suddenly I saw this brilliant light in the sky and I fell down and I was blinded by it. And I heard Jesus speaking to me. Who are you? And he said, I am Jesus whom you're persecuting. You know the story. So he said, I saw this light. I heard this voice. Jesus spoke to me. And if you read Paul's views on resurrection, he talks about this physical body must be transformed into an invisible body. This material must be transformed into imperishable. We have to be transformed. And the resurrection is a transformation, not a resurrection of a physical body, which is what the church doctrine becomes. If you know,
there is a cold fluid that has been chiefly found in the brain that joins the physical body at conception and helps it operate. And I don't mean supplements it, I mean helps it operate. They just don't know how. But it coordinates and guides the development of growth. This same cold fluid is coined by Victor Inyushin as bioplasma because, well, it's plasma, and it animates us. If you want to, you can call it our ghost. This discovery might not be so new, as Aristotle himself describes the same thing, but he called it Pneuma. He took it further, though, and said that Pneuma, or what we call bioplasma, leaves the body at death to rejoin with the ether in the heavens. Basically, space not being void is another thing he was spot on about long before our aforementioned friend Fritz Zwicky got in so much heat over telling us that space was not empty. Aristotle said that this plasma body cannot die at all. It either transforms or goes up to merge with the celestial spheres. He was certainly heavily motivated by this theory of a fifth state of matter. So here we go again with another modern parallel. An English translation of a paper entitled, well, Bioplasma, the Fifth State of Matter, says this: a living organism can be described as a biological field. We have obtained evidence that a fifth state of matter, bioplasma, exists as a part of each organism's biofield. Bioplasma consists of ions, free electrons, and free protons. It is highly conductive and provides opportunities for the accumulation of transfer of energy within the organism as well as among different organisms. Bioplasma appears to be concentrated in the brain and the spinal cord. At times, it may extend considerable distances from the organism, raising the possibility of telepathic and psychokinetic phenomenon. Okay, so I need a moment here. I mean, this plasma stuff is pulling laboratory science right into the lane of Kundalini. Kundalini episode on the way. Stay tuned. Light is emitted as a sign of death as well. In 1916, physicist Leonard Frohlich discovered biophotons. And if you text biophotons, spell correct will jump on and say that it's wrong because the word isn't used anymore, because we don't study it anymore. Robert Temple writes, changes in biophoton emission rates are the earliest possible sign of cancer. So early is their warning that millions of lives could be saved or significantly extended if a mass biophoton detection program were adopted. With such extremely early warnings, incipient tumors could be removed before they become dangerous when they were still only a few cells in size. Biophoton detection is not invasive and does not require expensive scanners. It does not bombard the body with radiation. It is an entirely passive process. It need cost very little. And that was the last nail in the coffin for biophoton research. But before its early death, this biophotonic light could be seen running along meridian lines on the body, kind of like the magnetic clusters rumored to exist along ley lines on Earth. And as above, so below. Dump number 2. Robert Temple compares this to chi energy, spelled Qi, as spoken about in Eastern mysticism and practiced by yogis then and today. With all this said, it seems as though yoga and Tai Chi are indeed a form of exercise for your ghost. So there is no wonder in that case why yogi practices are just as effective for the psyche and mental clarity as it is for the actual body. Plasma seems to be the missing link between the two. Biophoton emissions are also recorded to happen roughly after the time of death, and thus they have been called necrotic photons, which is a death metal band name just waiting to happen. Like the opposite of the light that we see entering the womb, this flash, described as a faint spark, is seen exiting the body like it has been perspirated. Perspiration means sweating, Sean. So this is light, and generally light comes from heat or friction, and that is just clearly not the case here. The only option we are left with is electricity, like, you guessed it, ball lightning. It comes up again. See the previous video. I'm tired. But it emerges from nothing, just like plasma. And this should be no surprise because lightning quite literally is plasma. Does this make lightning sentient? And is that why your local Catholic youth pastor has been hit by lightning 3 times? You know, because of what he did? No, some of these jokes don't make it after the edits. That little bit will just make the uncensored Patreon version only. Although it is really no wonder about electricity and the human body. I mean, look at the human nervous system and look at lightning. They are, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but exactly the same. Hey, as above, so below, dunk number 3. Temple's book, linked in the description, also lists a whole bunch of anecdotal accounts of people seeing ectoplasm with their own eyes because of various dramatic circumstances that seem to thin the barrier between our perception and the other side. I don't want to dwell in this area because, well, stories are not evidence, but for the sake of mythological connections, I would like to read one that just gave me chills. I have seen ectoplasm on the battlefield. I have watched it emanate from a badly wounded soldier and then disappear as that soldier breathed his last. One comrade from Kentucky called it soul mist, revealing that many natives in his part of the country considered it quite a normal thing, although they seldom talked about it. He went on to tell how, after being wounded with shrapnel, another soldier lay badly wounded about 10 feet from him. Quote, I looked at him with pity, forgetting my own pain. Then, in the deepening twilight, I saw a strange smoke. It began to curl above him, as though coming from his stomach as he lay on his back moaning. Then I remembered what my friend had said about soul mist, and I watched fascinated as the ectoplasm became denser and began to flow towards me. For a moment, I thought I saw in it the face of a kindly old lady. It reached me, and for a second, I was bewildered by a strange sensation that came over me. I felt stronger. With my left arm, I raised myself and began to crawl to the dying soldier. I reached for my canteen of water. The mist was still around me, and with a sudden effort, I was on my feet. To my dying day, I shall believe the ectoplasm from the body of that dying soldier had helped me in a very mysterious way. It had given me sufficient strength to save my life. And I suppose that would be considered like a walk-in of sorts. The Prana or Pneuma or Plasmid or Ghost added its life force animation to another living body after its previous container could no longer hold it. Perhaps the electricity within is what holds onto this plasmatic consciousness, and when the lights go out, so does the ghost. But, oh, wait a second. This brings up some concerns. Things come to mind like demonic possession and so-called summoning of spirits, which by no means will be happening in my damn house. It also brings up reincarnation. How many accounts have you heard of children who can accurately describe their former self, who just so happens to be deceased and match their every descriptive detail? I know I've read over a dozen of these impossible stories. We also know from our last video that, like our Kordylewski clouds, plasma has an incredible ability to hold and retain information. If the plasmoids move from location to location and can store information, does that include memory? Shoot, does that include personality and characteristics? And if that is the case, how are there more people now than there were centuries ago? Can ectoplasm upgrade from plant to animal to person to planets to stars and so on, like described by Itzhak Bentov? Well, I watched a couple interviews with Robert Temple, and before I play this clip, keep in mind that Temple is not an exaggerative person. In fact, as we showed in our video, The Serious Problem, Temple does not put up with any woo-woo anything and calls out BS when he sees it. Then he goes and lets this little gem slip right here.
They must be benign, because if they didn't like us, we wouldn't still be here. They must be in favor of our continued existence, and they're probably hoping that we will make it, that the experiment will have a satisfactory result. And I do believe they send inspiration. There are, in my opinion, evil entities, plasma entities of a lesser scale, who are constantly trying to block progress, who are crazy. She called them the lizards. Now, this did not come from David Icke. It can't come down because the lizards have taken over the planet. Well, that was her word, not mine. I'll make a shocking comment here. What is this about lizards? If you realize that nothing ceases to exist that's alive, and you consider the extinction of the dinosaur bioplasma beings weren't destroyed, only their physical bodies were. In other words, there may be lots of people walking around who are reincarnations of Tyrannosaurus Rex. Well, that would explain a lot, wouldn't it? Because they're ferocious and want to bite and kill and chew and eat everybody. Very
so
basic.
they're operating from that level of mentality.
Yes. In other words, the bioplasma beings of the dinosaurs have probably been human for millions of years because bioplasma entities can't cease to exist. They're still around. And this could explain the problem. They want control, you see, so they rise to the top because they devote all their energies to that, and they don't care who gets hurt.
So, as a mere entertainer here, how am I supposed to handle the fact that my ears just heard one of the most staunch scientists and no-nonsense researchers say that people be running around here haunted by dinosaur ghosts? I mean, shoot, this material writes itself. So if plasma contains information and is essentially loose non-atomic particles like charged protons and electrons, this brings up what has been called information theory. And with that, everyone's favorite physicist just entered the chat. Let's hear what David motherfucking Bohm has to say. The notion of an original energy acting to inform or put form into a much larger energy has significant applications in many areas beyond quantum theory. Consider a radio wave whose form carries a signal. The voice of an announcer, for example. The energy of the sound that is heard from the radio does not in fact come from this wave, but from the batteries or the power plug. This latter energy is essentially informed, but takes up its form from the information within the radio wave. This information is potentially active everywhere, but only actually active when its form enters into the electrical energy of the radio, or a wave entering a particle. This implies that an electron or any other elementary particle has a complex and subtle inner structure that is at least comparable with that of the radio. Nature may be far more subtle and strange than was previously thought. And Temple chimes in here. David Bohm's supreme mathematical imagination enabled him to suppose that large amounts of information in a simple seeming particle might interact not only with the fields we already know about, but also with another as yet unknown field, another dimension, something that might even be a cosmic intelligence beneath the fields that we know about and ordering them. He called this the implicate order, and he believed and described in the language of science how the explicit order, the universe we see and experience with our senses, could unfold out of the implicate one. Lao Tzu just entered the chat. He understood this unfolding process to work like a hologram. If you break down a hologram into bits, each bit will contain an image of the entire object. This driving ordering process is equally present everywhere in the universe. It underlies our intelligence, the intelligence we see in animals and plants, and the intelligence we saw in the movements of plasma near the start of this scientific journey. So, what does this all mean? If this new and ancient science is correct, that means good news and bad news. Good news is nobody ever actually dies. The bad news is, well, nobody actually dies. We gotta pause and think about that sometimes. And no doubt, it can be very frightening and even lead to some kind of existential crisis, breakdown, because you are stuck with yourself. I am stuck with myself. Is that okay with me? If my answer is no, then it is time to adjust the way my thoughts and feelings circulate. And I truly wonder if anyone can affirmatively answer yes to that question. Perhaps then, this is what the entire species is supposed to work on. And maybe this is the very thing that we are meant to figure out for ourselves on a global level. Perhaps this is why, as we said in our last video, the plasmas seem to be studying us as much as we are studying them. We are interested in its attributes and have even tried to weaponize it. But it seems to be studying something much different. our behavior. We have said many times that the judgment at the end of one's mortal life does not come from an outside seer. When we die, it is us that has to deal with the consequences of us. Perhaps this answers the age-old question that prides atheists to ask. If God is real, why does he allow so much suffering? Well, the obvious answer is usually something along the lines of God is not a personality. He is the very beingness that allows reality to exist, the canvas that the paint goes on, followed up, of course, by the old reliable, not what the eyes can see, but that by which the eyes can see. Know that to be Brahma the Eternal. But let's pretend for a moment that he is a personage of some abstract form, and he is thus living through us to experience reality, to experience himself, of course. In that case, how selfish would it be to only experience pleasures? Well, surely no omnipotent being would leave out the other half of anything. If he wants to experience everything, he would need suffering to experience the whole, to become whole. Plasma can be individual plasmoids, but being that they are quantum particles, they are also, spooky action at a distance, entangled. Then the entire universe is such, entangled. But that means us as well. Perhaps we should stop thinking of ourselves as individual ghosts and start thinking of ourselves the way that the Kordylewski clouds see us, as one global ghost. And as we all die together, the judgment we have to face is from us. The priests were busy mapping out the stars, knowing that the new pharaoh was to be born. Because everything that is below has a parallel to what is above. They would communicate with these above worlds using the Ankh for guidance. To the OG Egyptians, stardust, of which we are all made, was meant to be awakened while on Earth, to be reunited with the invisible world from which it came. So this map would be of great importance at the end of this pharaoh's physical life when he is to undergo his actual birth. Experiencing life on Earth was necessary, but dwarfs in comparison to the place he was to go. And so his entire life was a class to prepare him for a submolecular transfer of consciousness. But because this involves leaving the tangible behind and literally becoming psyche alone, thus experiencing the mind directly with no filtration, there is a danger at the center of this undertaking, and the consequence is eternal. Because if there be any guilt within him during this ordeal, he would not survive the genetic transfer and be overcome by Apophis. After ruling for ages and studying the glyphs that, like equations, illustrate the subatomic universe of nanoparticles and electricity seen as the backbone of reality, he was ready to move from one state to another. Before his body had a chance to grow old and decay, he ingested the formulas of gold kombucha tinctures to prepare his gut bacteria to receive the elixir or mana. A solution of DMT extract from Blue Lotus assisted him in moving his consciousness down through the underworld, that is, his own digestive tract. The coffer text, acoustically chanted, made sure that the spirit plasmoid would remain tethered to the body as it was invisible and would soon become a wave of non-form and non-locality. His years of preparation on Earth enabled him to successfully navigate the duat, to find and shake awake his unused DNA to full awareness, in which there was a code left over as a message from all ancients before him. Those very serpents of information were read and decoded by the scribe Tahuti, doing the job we now attribute to mRNA, communicating to build proteins that will grow in the tangible world, or in this case, to make form in the world of Apophis. But our pharaoh wasn't about to let this happen, because Apophis was unaware of the tincture. The king had fermented his body's lactose into E. coli as a viral inhibitor of this process, while increasing the gut's processing speed with cocaine. If he had got caught, it would already be too late. The king created a gap in the chain of sequence between the mRNA and the protein. Apophis was dunked on, and now our pharaoh could fill that gap in the genome with a very particular genre of light. Utilizing the left eye of Seth, what is now known as the lambda, a gene receptor, he cloned his own genetic code and attached the copy to the highest fluidic frequency available to the human body, the plasma.
Hey, man.
What?
Can we, reel it in right here? This is getting way too ridiculous.
I'm just trying to drive the point home that they were advanced.
Okay, then they'll read Judy's book for themselves.
That's my
Let's
job.
keep it entertainment here.
Well,
That's how
no,
we stay out of trouble.
this way they can see.
Stay in your damn lane,
God.
Pop.
Okay, so basically his physical cells began to die off as his canoe crew arrived, making this the moment that he was waiting for. One copy traveled down to remain on Earth within multitudes of animal life to experience the entirety of the food chain of which he was once a part, because he wanted to remain entangled with the suffering of Earth. This would be of great importance to us future generations later. But the other copy, well, for King Amenhotep, it was time to be born. The body of the pharaoh was in full death process as it was brought into the king's chamber of the Great Pyramid, and the machines were turned on, machines known today as particle accelerators. He recognized the vibrations, seeing the cymatics take place all around him, and knew it was showtime, and our king was not interested in reincarnation. The charged plasmatic nanoparticles merged to the stardust laying dormant in the blood, and he attached himself to the ignition. He was now, by definition, electricity, activated plasma that could never die or be destroyed. But this Earth realm was getting a little boring. It was time to live amongst the Neters, in the stars, to watch and maybe guide humanity in its cosmic evolution. The hydrogen within the pyramid was compressed, and the friction of quartz and limestone rocketed his now plasmatic sentience in the direction of the particular stars mapped out by the priest kings before he was born. He was free of organs that played the role of archons, and his body was left a mummified shell of a cocoon. In a flash of light, he was gone. If something exists in a wave format, it has no weight or density, and so no limitations existed for him now, not even the speed of light. This was handy, because now he could communicate with other cosmic quantum entities through entanglement. 99% of the universe was now his in an instant, and his first stop, he would be paying a visit to the Ka and the Ba, or what the Gnostics called a Metatron, one of two beings that we now call a Kordylewski cloud. In his book, The Cosmic Connection, Carl Sagan wrote that human evolution was the result of incoming cosmic rays from some distant neutron star. Of course, this seems to be written before he was told to calm the F down, supposedly. His point, though, being that we are truly one with the all, the cosmos. And this is no metaphor. Even the rate of blood clotting is directly related to the solar activity at the time of an injury. If you combine Sagan's idea with the fact that our ancients did not see human progress as linear, but as cyclical recursions, we might turn our attention to the Yuga cycles that lead great, dark, and golden ages, or what Plato called the Great Year. Now, the Yuga cycles will have to be a video all its own, but worth mentioning here is that the uprise of the Earth on this cosmic sine wave would indeed expose us to a few candidate neutron stars that emit specific electromagnetic spectrums of light. This climb and dip also seems to coincide on a timeline with surges in technology like the Great Pyramids, as well as the loss of these advanced abilities, going into what we literally call the Dark Ages. But the question remains, is this a wonderful cosmic accident, or is there something alive living amongst the stars that is bending this electromagnetic radiation to its will and shaping humanity on purpose? If we look at EM and ELF radiation and the way it interacts with plasma, of which we all are, then this unbelievably seems to be the case. But hold up, we'll get there. So you've heard the quote on this channel before, people don't have ideas, ideas have people. But the quote stops there, leaving us wondering if ideas are an entity all their own without a vessel just floating around in space-time. Well, this seems to be unlikely, perhaps not impossible, but way outside of our current notion of what consciousness is. If we read the accounts of people who have had world-changing ideas, as well as multiple persons who have all been struck by the same idea all at once at the same time, but in completely different places, we see a bit of a theme. And surprise, surprise, that theme is flashes of light. Before we go into the shamans of ancient times, perhaps it would be best to look in our own backyard, to the man who invented the tech that allows you to see and hear me right now. Who knows how much of Nikola Tesla's autobiography has been redacted? I don't know, but in it, what we have left of it, he writes this. In my boyhood, I suffered from a peculiar affliction due to the appearance of images, often accompanied by strong flashes of light, which marred the sight of real objects and interfered with my thought and action. Then I observed to my delight that I could visualize with great facility. I needed no models, drawings, or experiments. Then I instinctively commenced to make excursions beyond the limits of the small world of which I had knowledge, and I saw new scenes. But I never had any control over the flashes of light to which I have referred. They were perhaps my strangest experience and inexplicable. They usually occurred when I found myself in a dangerous or distressing situation, or when I was greatly exhilarated. In some instances, I have seen all the air around me filled with tongues of living flame. While in Paris in 1883, I had long been confined to the factory, and the fresh air had a wonderfully invigorating effect on me. On my return to the city that night, I felt a positive sensation that my brain had caught fire. I saw a light as though a small sun was located in it, and I passed the whole night applying cold compressions to my tortured head. Finally, the flashes diminished in frequency and force, but it took more than 3 weeks before they wholly subsided. These luminous phenomena still manifest themselves from time to time, as when a new idea opening up possibilities strikes me. When I close my eyes, I invariably observe first a background of very dark and uniform blue. This field becomes animated with innumerable scintillating flakes of green, arranged in several layers and advancing toward me. Then there appears to the right a beautiful pattern of two systems of parallel and closely spaced lines, at right angles to one another in all sorts of colors, but gold predominating. Thereafter, the lines grow brighter and the whole is thickly sprinkled with dots of twinkling light. This picture moves slowly across the field of vision and in about 10 seconds vanishes to the left, leaving behind a ground of rather unpleasant and inert gray, which quickly gives way to a billowy sea of clouds, seemingly trying to mold themselves into living shapes. Certainly, Lil Nicky was a lot more sensitive to this type of communion with ideas than others at the time, or now. He goes on to describe that these flashes of light and visions of angels enabled him to work without the restrictions of the repetitious scientific method. And the proof is in the pudding, i.e. his inventions. Despite having Neil deGrasse Tyson busy doing backflips and not inventing anything of his own. So this visionary state is rare nowadays, only to the gifted. But what about back in ancient times when our planet was zipping past the sightline of that neutron star that Sagan spoke of? Do we have evidence that these occurrences were more common when the planet was looking down the barrel of an electromagnetic shotgun? Or did you have to be like a shaman with the right DNA to receive this blessing and curse? Well, about 80,000 years ago, people of the Congo began making barbed bone hooks for fishing, while some people who dwelt in caves in the Blombos of South Africa began creating none other than expressive art. These included abstract wall designs and decorative jewelry. It is obviously difficult to know what was going on back then, but there is evidence of a common ritual taking place where shamans would go into these pitch black caves and see new ideas. Let's keep this in mind for a moment. But oh so coincidentally, the ice core samples show a dramatic up in cosmic radiation smacking the Earth at this exact time, the first occasion of 3 major radiation events. The next one shows as occurring about 40,000 years ago, where we have a quite sudden emergence of complex societies. This was when Homo sapiens first entered Europe and included religious practices, funerals, carvings of animals, and of course, these very sophisticated cave art like in Chauvet in France. Unbelievably, at the same time, hundreds of caves from all over the world became rapidly illustrated simultaneously, and this went on for quite some time until about 12 or 13,000 years ago when it, as you know, all ended so abruptly. But ancient shamans of this prehistoric time are said through oral traditions to go into caves where no visible light would interfere with their spiritual visions. They would go into trance one way or another, often with the help of hallucinogenic brews that we have talked about, and would see bright flashes of light inside their heads, followed by answers to many questions concerning healing, traveling, and even war. Visions that worked then and still do today when it comes to the healing part. Many of you remember us talking about Jeremy Narby listing some of these miraculous and proven cases in his book, The Cosmic Serpent, as well as himself going down there to have his sciatic pain completely cured. Fast forward to today, and we know of Cherenkov radiation. They can cause ghostly flashes of white and blue as they pass through the human head, and they do indeed pass right through. And this is how we study photons today, in deep underground facilities that are uninterrupted by the normal visible light spectrum. We can more finely hone in on the study of these so-called particles when the rest of the bulk radiation has been blocked by the ground above. Just like the shamans did with caves. They blocked out all other distractions and were able to catch and absorb the proper radiation to have these visions. And in a segment that I like to call Scientists with Huge Balls, we have the Hungarian expert on space biology at Berkeley named Cornelius A. Tobias. He predicted that this cosmic radiation would interrupt the vision of astronauts no matter how well shielded their vessels were. Not to be confused with the ones being filmed here on Earth, you know, to pocket funding money. Andrew Collins writes about this badass physicist in the book Lost Knowledge of the Ancients. To test his hypothesis, he devised a unique but very dangerous experiment. He decided to expose himself to subatomic particles produced by UC Berkeley's particle accelerator, which has been described as a veritable cosmic ray factory. Part of its function is to rip away electrons from heavy elements including iron and then focus the nuclei into a beam of particles which are then accelerated to virtually the speed of light, like the jets produced by neutron stars. Tobias quite literally stuck his head in the flow of particles and observed something almost unique on Earth. Quote, It is an exhilarating sensation. It is as though you are looking into the universe itself, unquote. Tobias repeated the experiment, even introducing his colleagues to the experience until the tests were finally discontinued on health grounds. Some cosmic rays might hit the brain directly, causing not only the sensation of light flashes, but also other seemingly external effects such as odd smells. In southern Greece, ascetic monks adhering to a form of religious devotion known as navel gazing have for centuries repaired to the darkness of caves on the mountain to witness the divine light and glory of God, which is compared with that experienced by the disciples on Mount Tabor, which is compared with that experienced by the disciples on Mount Tabor at the time of the transfiguration of Jesus. Okay, so that brings up the transfiguration of Jesus, and hearing this, we might assume that it was also flashes of white light, but this assumption would be a mistake, because this strange happening is like something straight out of a paranormal story. It is written that the tongues of light would appear out of nowhere and hover over the heads of the apostles as Jesus would reappear resurrected as, quote, a radiant glory. Robert Temple compares these tongues of light to the plasmatic entities that we have been speaking of in these last couple episodes. Worth noting is that Nikola Tesla himself also wrote about mysterious tongues of light that only he could see, which no doubt would make him out to be a crazy person if it wasn't for his brilliance. And of course, I can't help but wonder, are these described as tongues because of how they are shaped, or because of what tongues do, which is to speak, of course? Wait, what were you thinking? On this next bit, keep in mind what we learned in our Plasma Apocalypse episode about plasma resetting the Earth with a great flood, as well as the content in our episode Absurdity concerning orbs of light and plasmoids that were successful in molding the ideas and situational outcomes of modern day people. Because if the dance of electromagnetic radiation from space with the inorganic plasmatic life forms can affect us this much, perhaps it also affects the very form and construct of the human genome. After all, it says that we are created in God's image. Besides the obvious, like the Fibonacci sequence, is there scientific evidence to back up this ancient notion of not only being made in God's image, but evolving over time according to the word? And if after death the ancient pharaohs went into the stars to join the Neter, which by the way were seen as forces of nature and not gods, then who were these beings and how old are they? And is there a chance that these pharaohs are working with the Neter today to manipulate life here on Earth to avoid another great reset? This might be what the geometry of the pyramids and ancient religious texts in their own unique way have been trying to tell us all along. Geneticist H.J. Mueller found that this radiation, mimicked in a laboratory setting, was a mutagen to the genome of fruit flies. This sparked a conversation as to the likelihood of cosmic rays guiding or at least making changes to human DNA. Now, Mueller did come to the conclusion that there was simply not enough of this cosmic radiation on Earth to do so. But as Andrew Collins points out, he was not aware of the Yuga cycles that surely do, every so often, put the entire Earth into the sightline aim of these very ancient stars. So In the constellation of Cygnus, from our point of view, there was a supernova explosion that showered the Earth in these cosmic rays. This was calculated to have happened 35,000 years ago and kept the shower going for almost 2,000 years in a row. The Earth, being in the right spot on our Yuga cycle, would have certainly went through great changes during this time. This so happens to be when ancient texts describe the rise and fall of a golden age on Earth. The reputable Dr. Aidan Meinel, a veteran of jet propulsion and the man responsible for the Hubble, spoke at a conference said to be packed with both archaeologists and students. And you can imagine the shock of everyone in the audience when he confidently claimed that, quote, high levels of beryllium-10 in the Greenland and Antarctic ice cores indicated that cosmic rays were responsible for the germline mutations in both animals and human life around 35 or 40,000 years ago. This is a coincidence even bigger than the security cameras malfunctioning on the one and only day that Jeff killed himself. Am I right? We don't have a picture for that. Dr. Aidan went on to say that this was the reason for the emergence of Cro-Magnon man and the mysterious disappearance of Neanderthal man who hunted him. As we know, modern humans defeating these absolute monsters called Neanderthal was seemingly impossible unless there was a very sudden spike in mental capabilities to outsmart them. Dare I use the word intervention? This is where Andrew Collins steps in to point out that the constellation of Cygnus is not only where these cosmic rays of genetic mutation come from, but it is also the oldest known constellation figure, being the swan or celestial bird. And being the oldest of that, we are reminded of our video Plasma Apocalypse again, where we found out that this kind of bird is also the oldest petroglyph that we have reoccurring in multiple parts of the world at the same time. We even see this Cygnus bird on the remote and isolated Easter Island. And if there is any confusion whether or not this bird glyph coincides with the constellation on the zodiac, well, Göbekli Tepe, being our far oldest predecessor, clears that right up, as seen on Pillar 43. If we go back to the previous mentioned cave painting explosion in France, we have this little favorite of mine. Cygnus is on a pole that seems to be a line moving down, possibly to Earth, and a therianthrope of a human man with a bird's head falling into trance, but separated from this violent gore of some kind of animal or beast that might represent the biggest distraction that mankind has, his lower animal nature. This line below the bird is strikingly reminiscent of the so-called sky pole that the ancient shamans used to climb into the sky world by way of cosmic axis. And hey, if it can come down, perhaps we can go up. But for me, they're gonna have to tie a whole bunch of knots throughout the sky rope to grab onto. Cygnus is also known as the Northern Cross due to its shape being that of a cross. Tying in a whole bunch of other stuff unrelated to this video, but I mean, you know, there you go. Collins writes that, and I quote, "It is the same story in stone worldwide, from the bird effigy mounds in North America to the Olmec centers in Mexico, the Incan sacred city of Cusco, the Egyptian pyramids in Giza, the Hindu temples of India, to the Irish and British megalithic stone complexes of Newgrange and Avebury, all of which seem to reflect an age-old interest in Cygnus. But a lot of these glyphs that represent Cygnus happened because the shamans went into the darkness of the caves. This is why many of the crude and rushed depictions happen deep inside the caves where they are not weathered. They were drawn, etched, or painted in the dark, only to be later carved more artistically into stone on pillars and temples later. The caves were the rough draft, and this happens to be where these flashes of light happen inside the heads of the shaman. The cave walls, just like the ground above our modern scientific facilities, filtered out all other light and radiation, except for these particular ancient cosmic photons delivered here from the most ancient celestial happenings in space, in this case, Cygnus. The coincidences here are zipping right past being evidence and into the realm of certainty in this case. But it still doesn't answer the question as to who or why this is happening. We just see that it is happening. And that ain't bad for now, considering that the established worldview on this is that everything fell into place accidentally. In his section of the book, Lost Knowledge of the Ancients, Andrew Collins writes this: resonating at some of the highest energies ever detected, they were quickly dubbed Cygons, later changed to Cygnets, meaning children of the swan. This amazing data led to the controversial claims that Cygnus X3 was the first identified cosmic particle accelerator in the galaxy. Cygnus X3 is a binary system composed of a dying Wolf-Rayet star that feeds a close proximity neutron star, producing streams of superheated plasma. And that kind of makes me wonder why it's called a Wolf-Rayet star, and we have all this ancient talk about, you know, the dog star, Sirius, and Anubis. This ejecta is shot out at relativistic speeds very close to the speed of light. These unimaginable beams, like cosmic searchlights, are held together by magnetic sheaths that produce powerful particle acceleration in a variety of frequency ranges, including X-rays, infrared, radio waves, and gamma rays. Astrophysicists announced that Cygnus X3 might well be the galaxy's first blazar, a term used when one of a deep space object's twin plasma jets is aligned toward our solar system. In other words, it is pointed straight at us. The ejecta produced by such jets could easily be responsible for increased levels of cosmic rays reaching Earth. This includes Cygnus X3's unique Cygnet particles that, being neutrally charged, reach the Earth directly from source and are able to penetrate deep underground, which is something that cosmic rays are usually unable to do, since they are positively charged and break up before they reach the surface of the planet. This staggering scenario, or scenario if you're an asshole, might well explain why our ancestors came to recognize the celestial swan as so important to their religious mindset, since there is every reason to conclude that ancient shamans who achieved altered states of consciousness in deep underground cave settings, most obviously using hallucinogens, somehow became aware of the effect Cygnus was having on their lives. It is widely known that we are all connected to each other, not just by means of sharing the same plasma and stardust, but also psychologically. But we are also connected by way of very low frequency electromagnetic waves known as ELF radiation. And as we cover this next bit, it might start to kind of make sense in a weird synchronistic coincidence yet not coincidental way that ELF spells elf. And elves are the very thing described as having communion with us under the influence of the second most powerful hallucinogen on Earth, known as DMT. Elves are also a staple in all folklore as etheric beings that are eager to speak with humans whenever they get a chance. On the opposing pole of frequency speed to that of gamma and X-rays, which are incredibly too fast to imagine, the human brainwave activity falls within the ELF range, and that is why it has been found to affect human behavior in various studies. Whether or not they can use that against us, we'll talk about in a little bit. Even lower than this is the frequency of the Earth itself, hovering at about 7 hertz. You might have heard of the Schumann resonance, and indeed it is no far cry theory that putting it on with the subwoofers on high will cause a calming sensation to the human nervous system, and to those with practice, strange etheric meditative states. Why? Well, very simply, we are a product of our environment, and when this pulse meets the pulse of our frequency, being the smaller party, we meet it halfway. And we are lucky to have access to these frequencies so instantly in today's age. To synchronize with the vibe of Earth, once upon a time required carefully calculated drumming and chanting, which essentially did the same thing. Whereas now I can find 7.8 hertz on a tone generator and play it for you right now. Oh yeah. Oh, that's the good stuff. Oh, it's like the purr of a kitten for the soul. It's like macaroni and cheese for your spirit. Side note, most of you know that I am a musician and write all of the songs at the end of these videos, doing my best to make Papa Pythagoras proud. But I also write the scores of these videos that you're hearing throughout them. If you have ever watched and wondered why some of you have had a deeply calming sensation or even hyper focus during certain parts, well, it's not my voice like many of the single mothers have expressed in the comments, but much of it comes from the tuning of these frequencies used. And that is by no way a placebo effect, considering that you didn't know it till I just told you. But Earth's heart oscillates at 7.8-ish hertz. There's changes taking place as of recently. But this frequency gets faster as it gets higher in the atmosphere, leaving the human nervous system right in the middle. We are very much subjects to this vibe, and not just our moods and ability to concentrate. The dynamics of these frequencies is how birds migrate and how whales find their way around when surrounded by nothing but endless abyss of ocean. AKA the most terrifying thing I can think of. Even the sun has a measurable frequency that is not just heard, but can be seen. Every 2 minutes and 40 seconds, the sun shrinks down in size and then re-expands. This motion is small to the sun, but is actually a measurable dip of 6 miles in and out. Is this a cosmic being's way of breathing? Is the Egyptian personification of Ra more literal than we assume today? Well, surely, if it was a conscious entity, it would break its own predictable habits from time to time. And it just so happens that in May 1999, a very strange anomaly happened that is so bizarre that we don't really even talk about it. I have noticed that when things are truly strange to us, we kind of just leave it alone, despite the important role that anomalies have in breaking our stubborn worldview. But for 2 entire days on that one and only particular year, the solar wind completely stopped. This obviously throws a wrench into our entire understanding of how the sun works. And it wasn't an equipment error. The solar wind has always been there 100% of the time. In fact, it is impossible for it to just quit, because supposedly it's fueled by an unimaginable amount of nuclear energy. So coming to a stop would be like pressing pause on an atom bomb, freezing time and then continuing where it left off a bit later, except on a much grander scale. This would only slightly make more sense if it were instead made up of plasmatic electricity. Just one of those many things that we can ask the question, is it impossible? Yes. Did it happen? Also yes. So who turned off the sun and why? Are we being protected from something in some way, like Jupiter protects us from asteroids? Or is there sentience at play here? I don't know. But if you consider what Robert Schoch tells us about the sun's repeating cycles of time that produce cataclysmic flares, we are and have been long overdue for one. But we are still kicking. Barely. Something that's weird as hell until you remember the time our nuclear weapons facilities literally went to go hit the button to launch, and a for real UFO shut off all its power and its backup generators. Something seems to be protecting us, it seems, from outside bombs as well as inside. Okay, though, let's reel it in and talk about these ELFs. When testing fringe ideas like telepathy, something we have indeed done with staggeringly positive yet not so repeatable results, we use what are called Faraday cages to block any potential transfer of information from person to person. These are known to block electromagnetic signals, but just like telepathy has been shown to do, these so-called ELF waves also pass right through without obstruction. And after seeing plasmoids with funny attitudes pass right through copper shields without at all having to change form, perhaps we shouldn't be surprised. We give too much credit to the integrity of solid, tangible matter as a control in many of these experiments. The legend himself, Itzhak Bentov, a now Lotus favorite here, has been quoted as saying, "Such a long wavelength knows no obstacles, and its strength does not attenuate much over long distances. Naturally, it will go through just about anything: metal, concrete, water, and of course, the fields making up our bodies. It is the ideal medium for conveying a telepathic signal. ELF can be used as a mode of radio communication where difficult, like with submarines." And speaking of water, the binding of molecules due to short-range static are set in as a consequence of molecular condensation induced by radiative fields. Without the word soup here, basically the reason water retains such a high amount of memory and information is because of ELF radiating fields within it. Whoa. And here we all are, made up of the same water that does this. This one's expensive. ELF and this electromagnetic stuff, this is real wave formats happening according to our scientific material world, not on the fringe, but at the same time, not only linked to, but also overlapping the fringe. We just have to open our eyes to what we have been told is not possible. We are told that telepathy is like magic, fun in theory, but just not real. But as made clear by author C. Clarke, magic is just tech that we don't understand yet. In this notion, the invisible signal that is decoded by your TV to play this video is magic, and by all means impossible until the day comes that it is. Here's the fruit though. Everything inside the phone that does this magic, the crystals, the electrons, the gold conductors, etc., are all available to us within the human body, making it not so weird to read about what the ancient pharaohs once did with these same materials. I mean, why do we think that gold and crystals have agelessly been seen as valuable even before the technology in your hand? We assume it's because they are pretty to look at, but so are sunsets, boobs, and babies. Most babies. And those things are not mentioned by the ancients as being ways to communicate with the other side or outer worlds. You know, they couldn't make iPhones out of babies. I mean, That is kind of what Apple is doing, though. So, like, between emerald stone of Thoth mythology, crystal skulls found all over the world, the gold in the Anunnaki stories and Old Egypt, the use of quartz in the pyramids, and so on. The more we look at it closely, the more we see that we are not unique today in the use of these minerals because of their relationship to unseen forces like plasma, electricity, and magnetic fields. The stuff we use for long-distance communication is the same that they used before us. It's almost embarrassingly clear. The only thing in the way is our ego that insists that we are the first. I mean, how else besides ego is it possible to see this thing called an Ankh that, despite being carved in stone, was said by the very people using it to be made of gold and crystal and used as a means of communication via the bulbous torus of plasma emerging from the top of it? And then we say, oh, it's just a symbol representing life. We use plasma in our screens today for communication. Perhaps they, being much greener, so to speak, just simply skipped the screen part and interacted with the plasma directly. I mean, I don't know, at this point it's speculation. But we are quite literally looking at something comedically described as a device, seeing that it would potentially work with the materials mentioned, and then saying, nah, it wasn't tech, it was superstition. I mean, okay, let's reel it in. Robert Schoch taught us a lot concerning plasma and earth-shattering catastrophes, of which we already covered. But in his same book, Forgotten Civilization, he goes on to talk about ELF radiation. A scientific description could well fit the notion of an ELF wave being the carrier wave of telepathic thoughts, even to the point that telepathy works better at night. The fact that the shamans can better reach a state of ecstasy in the dark may also be an indication that they are using ELF waves, probably in the Schumann frequencies, to reach altered states of consciousness. This may be an extremely ancient technique of gaining knowledge. Thus, ELF waves in the Schumann frequency range may be a way that one human consciousness can connect with another and also tap into the larger collected consciousness and the Earth as a whole. ELF waves and Schumann frequencies are strongly affected by and even regulated by astronomical factors, including the relative positions of and resonances among the sun and planets. Here again, we discover correlations that, according to the dogma of conventional, established science, are totally Here again, we discover correlations that, according to the dogma of conventional established science, are totally unexpected or even impossible. According to the new science, there are meaningful relationships among fundamental physical phenomena, astronomical phenomena, and brainwaves, which in turn affect states of consciousness. Using different terminology, mystics and certain scholars have accepted and explored such connections since ancient times. The work demonstrating that spontaneous cases of telepathy and clairvoyance are correlated with geomagnetic fluctuations supports this hypothesis. Very disturbing to me personally, Schoch's words here, not mine, is the ongoing high-frequency active auroral research program. Ooh. Oh, we're going in. We're going there. Let's do it. This is used to send signals and energy into the ionosphere in order to see what will happen. I seriously wonder what inadvertent or intentional is in parentheses here, effects the HARP experiments might have. Could ionospheric disruptions caused by HARP have subtle but profound effects on life, including human mental states. On another front, I am concerned that the constant modern bombardment of people by electromagnetic radiation from cell phones to radio communications to power lines to circuits and walls may have ill and unexpected consequences. There is increasing evidence that organisms, including humans, may be sensitive to ultra-weak electromagnetic fields. Well, that started out nice and escalated quite quickly, didn't it? Without getting into conspiracy here, as that's just not my game, but does tend to come up in an unignorable way. Is it possible that the modern man-made E-waves that surround us today, and by all means make our lives better, could be interrupting the signals that are sent to us from these ancient cosmic happenings like Cygnus? By a bit of possibly ill-executed logic on my part, it seems that if shamans needed absolute silent darkness with no distractions to harness the powers of insight gifted from Cygnus and other cosmic hotspots, then disrupting the signal wouldn't take much, especially now. And the best way to do that would be with a nice distraction sandwich. A sandwich that would be threefold in this case. The first way would be the information carried. If a woman talks about spitting on a penis or a president gets shot, it is readily available to everyone immediately and makes for conversation very adjacent to what is important. Well, I shouldn't say important, but adjacent to whatever's happening in the causal whatevers. The second way would be the medium of information signal itself. It's a frequency wave. And how many of those can we possibly process at once in a human body? And the third way, being a distraction sandwich, would be the white bread. Yep, I'm blaming the white bread. But like the minerals and metals used in both ancient golden ages and today, it seems that everything that happened back then has a parallel to today, where we seem to interrupt these cosmic rays of communion. They seem to exacerbate it, and they often did this through sound. It is no longer fringe that the ancient megalithic sites utilized sound frequency manipulation by design. What does remain on the fringe is the idea that they did this to alter their own consciousness and thus thin the tangible barrier between us and the other side. Wayland Smithy, whose last name is Smithy, summarizes his team's findings. Rudimentary acoustical measurements performed inside 6 diverse Neolithic age structures revealed that each sustained a strong resonance at a frequency between 95 and 120 Hertz. Despite major differences in chamber shapes and sizes, the resonant modal patterns all featured strong antinodes at the outer walls, with appropriately configured nodes and antinodes interspersed toward the central source. Interior and exterior rock drawings resembled these acoustical patterns. Since the resonant frequencies are well within the adult male voice range, one may speculate that some forms of human chanting enhanced the cavity resonance were invoked for ritual purposes. Robert Schock adds to this. Stone structures, pillars, and enclosed spaces could be used to magnify, conduct, and enhance certain sounds, producing resonances and standing waves, while filtering out other sounds. According to Enoch in Popular Archaeology, regional brain activity in a number of volunteers was monitored by EEG machines. The findings indicated that at 110 Hz, the patterns of activity over the prefrontal cortex abruptly shifted, resulting in a relative deactivation of the language center and a temporary shifting from left to right-sided dominance related to emotional processing and capability in the brain. In addition to stimulating their more creative sides, it appears that an atmosphere of resonant sound in the frequency of 110 or 111 Hertz would have been switching on an area of the brain that biobehavioral scientists believe relates to mood, empathy, and social behavior. Deliberately or not, the people who spent time in such an environment under conditions that may have included a low male voice in ritual chanting or even simple communication were exposing themselves to vibrations that may have actually impacted their thinking. How curious that such varied ancient structures, separated by so much time and distance, should have common features which imply sophisticated knowledge. Did the architects of the day each make and develop their own discoveries, or did they inherit a concept from some older school of learning? And it must have been from an older school of learning indeed, because when that article was written in 2012, they had no idea that Göbekli Tepe has the same archaeoacoustic purposes as the other megalithic sites that came after it. In fact, some of the stones ring like a bell when they are struck, like they were hollowed out and somehow made of a substance differing from stone. Another example of asking the question, is it impossible? Yes, but do it indeed be that way? Well,
this is what it does.
And speaking of the bird of Cygnus being the oldest glyph and constellation, well,
here? Why it sounds like a bird? Don't ask me that, because we don't know. Experts from different countries, experts in acoustics, have come here to study.
We touched on a few things today that, like the acoustical sound thing we just chatted up, will have to be its own future video on cymatics and ancient tech. And another one on the memory of water and so on will have to be their own videos. But we also referenced a few other videos from this very channel because, well, the connections certainly speak for themselves. But the intro of today's episode was one of the most difficult I've ever had to write due to sheer complexity alone, and there is a bit of a funny story behind it. Before I share that, after hearing me do a rough draft of the script, Romany Rivers, a author and a member here at the channel, opened one of her Nikola Tesla books, and the first page she opened up to, she couldn't help but take a picture of it and send it to me. The scientific world laughed at him. They said no such rays existed. Tesla proved they did. That much is history. So today, due to the attitude of supposed scientific experts, who in reality are not truly scientific, because of them, very little is known about the subject, but some wise men have discovered that our atmosphere is continually being bombarded by atomic particles from outer space. These are known as primary cosmic rays. This is really hard to read, guys. Sorry, it's a picture on a cell phone. In my opinion, says Tesla, the reason for their lack of knowledge is because they neglect to study the Bible, for in it is the place where Tesla first discovered them. 35 years before the scientific world, experts thought maybe they might exist. And that's a little section that would have got right by me if it wasn't for the comments. And in Robert Temple's book here, he talks about being so in tune with this cosmic communion that he too can go to a bookshelf and open it right up to the middle somewhere and find the source of what he's looking for. Our video DMT in St. Peter, the Anubis vibe check, was the result of a comment that our friend Sarah left on a video. When she laid out her theory in the comments, it just immediately clicked for me, and I couldn't believe that I hadn't made that connection myself. And others, from Eric's near-death experience to Telenus Terp hypothesizing that Göbekli Tepe was an initiation labyrinth of some sort. Jade Lore commented about the Dogon connection to Saturn, and our friend Nicorical made comments that indicated a connection between Amenti being an allegory for a possible literal Agartha, all of which went from the comment section to being full-blown documentaries on this channel. Another member of our community that I can't even name helped us out with the Masonic symbology video. Corey from Black Raven Meditation showed me how to breathe properly when having an anxiety flare-up. Cheryl made me realize that astrology goes a lot deeper than I thought and blew my mind with my own birth chart. Lugal's World asked me if I would be willing to turn gay. I mean, we really do have a lovely and dynamic community here. Most YouTubers avoid the comment section, but I seem to thrive there. The communion between you guys, even amongst each other, is like a fuel for me. Now, make note though, you'll never get secondhand information from me on these videos. I hit the books instead of the internet for the facts and the research studies. But the hypotheses, the speculations, the way out connections, and the overall what ifs, basically the backbone of this channel is a lot because of you guys. Not only as a viewer, but as a way of communion. It's like YouTube is my ankh and you guys are the higher realms that I pull inspiration from. Well, you know, except for Sean. So about that funny story on the intro. Well, when Elisanya, owner of House of Healing, a metaphysics shop in Norway, commented on our video, The Nine and the Primordial Question, that these squiggly elbow creatures that I've seen in altered states were the conscious remnants of Egyptian pharaohs that send viral persuasions down to earth to flesh out new ideas through people as a medium. Well, I thought it was crazy. Fun, but crazy nonetheless. And then one after another, here and there, comments on other videos seemed to add weight to this outlandish theory. People would type out their own trip reports or comment something they heard from Terence McKenna or whatever. And I began to think, what if? And explored the idea only as entertainment. Led me to Judy King's very overlooked work, The Isis Thesis, as well as the Egyptian Book of the Dead, but like in a new light with fresh eyes. All of a sudden, I felt like I wasn't looking at hieroglyphics anymore. We have always assumed that this form of language was just pictures because they didn't have letters yet. But wait a second. These guys had the most advanced architecture on Earth, still today, and we are assuming their language was pictograms, like a damn set of emojis and a text you would get from Sean's mother-in-law when she discovers the eggplant symbol after having one too many Long Island iced teas. Is it an insult to these ancient Egyptian brilliant minds for us to assume anything? What I came to realize is that the hieroglyphic language was much closer to equations. Not mathematical, of course, but equations nonetheless, carefully thought out and set in stone for universal communion with us, the future. Had they used an alphabet to describe the phage lambda and its role in RNA processing, we would have never known, as the vocabulary would have been even more alien to us than the glyphs. So, through way of both parabolic illustrations and subtle spacing and timing, they put their message in a way that was both allegory and literal. but most importantly, beautiful. The aesthetic kept us mystified and curious all these years until we were finally advanced enough to put two and two together. And there's still a lot of work to do. As I'm brought these new angles and insights, I realized that no man is an island, and there is no individual things in the universe. There are only relationships. A thing is a thing because it is not what something else is. Likewise, a person is only a person because they are not who another is. The differences are what makes identity possible in the first place. Having a mountain of gold is useless without something to apply it to. And the funniest joke on earth is pointless without a separate ear to catch it. So, if you think about it, on both a grand scale and the subatomic, the only thing that exists is communication. The only thing that information has is communion, and thus, the only thing that we have is each other. Over 1,000 years before year zero, you walked out of your home and gazed up into the world of the ancestors. This world, the source of life and death, was no stranger. After all, you celebrated death for everything it potentially had to offer. After surviving a long, toiling experience beneath the earth, within a labyrinth of stone, skull, and bones, you have proven yourself worthy of immortality. But today, the sky was different. Lit up bright in the fluid darkness was an ominous shape of one of God's workmen, the same shape that you have seen carved in stone your entire life. Walking up the hillside, you find one of the wise elders of your community standing at the peak of the land, and you ask him if this angel is a bringer of death. But because you already know the answer, he doesn't bother to directly respond. Instead, he gives you an order to give to the others. He says, "We will need to work together to bury the labyrinth beneath a pot-bellied hill, because the sun has mood swings according to our behavior here on Earth." This is confusing to you. What does this have to do with the sun? You ask him, why would we spend so much time and effort burying something that we have already spent so much effort to build? His answer was as startling as it was mind-bending. He tells you that millions of years ago, dragons ruled the earth and fed upon a small rodent that remained meek compared to the Goliath beasts that ruled the planet, and that this setup was unchangeable to anything of earth, that is, specifically to this earth, and so it remained that way for millions of years. But one day, he tells you, an angel of death, tangibly different from the one you are looking at tonight, came from the sky. He explained that this angel was in fact not of death, but of change, and that our human sight is too limited and temporary to see this eternal truth. Then he gestured over to the chickens sleeping in their pen and spoke, "Those are the dragons that once ruled the earth, and now we consume them." So you ask him with a shudder, "And the rodents? What became of them?" He answered, "They have become us." You see, what we think of as death is actually transformation. God is so powerful that he can turn all dragons into chickens and all rodents into... He was interrupted by a clap of thunder that came from the wings of a phoenix bird that seemed to emerge from that strange shape in the sky. Everything lit up as if day when a vicious pink serpent struck some pillars of the labyrinth, knocking them over. Damn, and now it's your job to fix it, you young stallion, you. Completely calm, the elder spoke. It is time to get this done. The gods will once again be changing the earth. The structure of man will not change, but the beasts of the earth will become smaller and easier to hunt. Excitedly, you exclaim, "Good, this will come in handy whenever we move them to the..." But you are interrupted by the intense glare of the elder as he elaborates. The structure of man will not change, but instead his soul. Mankind will be making a trade. But trading what for what? You scratch your head and you get to it, knowing that he is not speaking mysteriously just to be coy. There are indeed things that he knows that you cannot wrap your mind around yet. The next week was spent burying the labyrinth with debris and loose rock before it was time to move everything underground, because this angel in the sky was becoming more and more violent by the hour, sending more and more destructive birds of prey, fire serpents, and strange mantis creatures to transform the entire landscape according to its will. But you don't worry, you trust its will. All the people, all the schools, all the cattle, all the supplies, everything was taken down into the subterranean city. The work was immense, but you would survive, or at least you thought you would. Because once you were half-assed settled into this new underground home, you approached the meditating elder to once again ask the question, why was so much effort expelled to bury the labyrinth? He spoke one devastating sentence. We must warn the future generations of the surface, because this generation is going to end. In our Mars video, we left off showing that there are huge gouges chunked out of the planet's surface. These are different from Mars's dried riverbeds and were not due to asteroid impacts. It impossibly seems to be the seed of the war in heaven mythology, considering that Mars is the personification of war in almost every myth. But what really happened? This symbol that has unfortunately become known as Squatting Man can be found on every continent all over the world, regardless of time period. It was drawn by multitudes of civilizations that supposedly had no contact with each other. If we buy that story, then we are left with a much weirder conclusion, that they all saw the same thing. It would be easy to say that this is an abstract human stick figure if it wasn't for the distinct features like the right angle knees, thin appendages, and elbows pointing directly up and down, and most notably, the two circles on either side. Many of the glyphs also display the neck sprouting off into multiple heads, or one big spiraling head. More elaborate depictions later in time show the figures holding lightning bolts or scorpions on either side while remaining symmetrical. With all of these, if it was found in one glyph, we would say, cool, moving on, and let the History Channel have their fun with calling it a mantis alien or something. But all of the above glyphs are found as an archetype in all cultures. Whatever it was could not be avoided and was revered by literally all people of Earth. Fast forward to today, and we don't give our ancient people enough credit. We always blame their activities on superstitions or worship, making us, I think, even more ignorant than we make them out to be. But Dr. Anthony Parrott at Los Alamos did a little experiment. He found that when charged particles move at a high velocity through a magnetic field, it causes pinch points and spirals, like pressured water or like smoke rings, but more stubborn and tough because these charged particles are what we call plasma. And you are looking at it right now inside your screen. And it might just be looking back. We'll get there though, hold on. When we see the northern lights, as we recently did all the way down here in St. Louis, it is basically this same plasmatic state of matter discharged from the sun passing through the Earth's magnetic field. It spreads out in an abstract and beautifully colored display, but it seems that if the discharge from the sun is violent and big enough, it creates synchrotron radiation. The plasma takes on many different forms, like columns and donut shapes resembling entwined serpents, human stick figures, and birds with their feathers fanned out. One might even describe all three together as a feathered, plumed serpent personified as a man. But again, we'll come back to all that jazz. Okay, so the plasma bursts and the petroglyphs look similar. So what? How can we possibly be sure of any connection that long ago? And can the sun even be unstable enough to cause synchrotron radiation to happen in the sky on a scale this large? Well, it just so happens that we have on record in recent history a plasma burst that would, well, it would be small compared to one that would affect the entire globe, but a solid flare-up nonetheless. This was called the Carrington event. It didn't reset the whole damn Earth, but it knocked out communications for a while and miles of trees down for good. And unlike those of our ancient ancestors, we can read the story of the witnesses of this particular event. And they describe, quote, figures in the sky as if drawn with fire on black backgrounds. Notable of the Carrington event is that telegraph operators were able to use their equipment without batteries for some time after the solar bursts. There was energy in the air. This goes to show that if we were advanced enough, we could find a way to benefit from something like this. We also have actual photographs of what are called sprites that occasionally flash very quickly in the upper atmosphere 100 or so miles above the Earth's surface. So sure, these resembling petroglyphs are all over the Earth, but they have another thing in common concerning the location of sketch relative to the longitude dimensions of Earth. The glyph orientations tend to have a southern point of view, and Perret concluded that the plasma burst in question had a, quote, a relativistic electron flow inward at Earth's south polar axis and hypervelocity proton impacts around the northern polar axis. Basically, the canvas is set up in front of the model. Okay, so if this is so huge, then why don't we see it? Well, if solar bursts large enough to reset civilization only happen every 10 or 20,000 years or so, it is safe to say that many generations between those events would have no knowledge of such events. This is exactly why it might be necessary to get a permanent message carved into stone. And if those warnings are not deciphered, it would lead the scientists of these very generations between the bursts to naively conclude that the sun is much more stable than it actually is. When we say, "Here comes the sun," it rings a pleasant Beatles tune. In Göbekli Tepe, once upon a time though, that song might have been better sang by Travis Ryan. Before moving on, I want to be clear that this hypothesis is not an explanation for strange phenomena. It is simply a furthering of exploration of the mysteries, and in fact opens up another can of worms about plasmatic sentience, literally intelligent awareness that might be watching and studying all the time and connects us to ancient religions. But just making sure that this video isn't confused with a video dismissing spiritual matters. After all, some of the symbols produced by this plasma experiment that vary from that so-called squatting man resemble symbols of multiple religions and mythologies, most prominently things like this branching out into this, and then those becoming this. A fantastic documentary called Symbols of an Alien Sky. They list many other comparisons between this plasma activity and mythic archetypal symbols embedded into the psyche of mankind, leading me to believe that there is more to this fourth state of matter than just a dead discharge. It might be closer to a someone rather than a something. So what does this have to do with that difficult time at Göbekli Tepe in our intro? Well, they are both connected to the Younger Dryas era. Now, I know you know all about that by now, so let's make this quick. Basically, we assumed that global flood myths were tall tales despite how abundant they are, but we found out about the Younger Dryas event from ice core sediment, abundance of other evidence that we have tendencies to overlook as too weird to be true. The Younger Dryas timeline shows the entire Earth heating up in a matter of days or even hours. Unprecedented unprecedented. This surely would have caused global floods. But the Younger Dryas was still not connected to the flood myths because there were no civilizations 12,800 years ago. Then the unburying of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey changed all of that overnight, but not without controversy, as Graham Hancock came bursting onto the scene like Stone Cold Steve Austin, ready to whoop some mainstream ass. Because Göbekli Tepe shows signs of advanced stonework, intentionally buried with what seems to be pictorial forms of writing that we call glyphs. It also, despite its controversy, showed that our usage of zodiacal symbols is much, much older than we have been told, raising a lot of other questions about the age of what we now call the esoteric. But here's where things get weird. And if that's not weird enough, modern people have unburied a very small portion of Göbekli Tepe. To this day, we have uncovered 2 stone enclosures. There are upwards of 16 to 20 of them. That means that all of this land has ancient knowledge intentionally hidden right beneath the surface. Looking at the rest takes funding that we certainly had, but you wasted on your avocado toast and mocha espresso. Those actually look really good. Now, the theme of this gargantuan setup is death, leading many to believe that it was home to an ancient skull cult. But I feel like we always paint our own biased superstitions onto things outside of our box. I personally feel like this is one of the oldest sacred schools of initiation, and I am hoping to bust out a full video on that, but check out Priest Kings to get the gist of what I mean, because the ancient Egyptians certainly didn't sprout from nothing. Speaking of Göbekli Tepe, geologist Robert Schoch visited this spot on his way to school to see it throw a wrench into our known history live and in person. He couldn't help but notice that Göbekli Tepe is between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, making it a possible link to the Garden of Eden. And indeed, this area over 12,000 years ago was abundant with plant life and multitudes of animals. But what is important here is that Göbekli Tepe has become synonymous with the end of the Ice Age. It seems as if it was built to warn future generations about things that caused the Ice Age in the first place, things that can happen again. Although this warning in stone might not be intentional, that part, I mean, we don't know. But if we look at the famous Pillar 43, known as the Vulture Stone, we see clear zodiacal representations and what seems to be a kind of map showing the times and parts of the sky that unleashed this death from above onto the world. We have a vulture gesturing to the sun. What do vultures represent to people of all ages? Behind this, we see abstract designs. Considering that everything else here is representing something in the sky, is it a stretch to say that this is our plasma burst we were talking about? Then moving down the line, we have a scorpion and a decapitated human. Again, representations that don't even need to be explained to the layman. That is what makes symbolism and glyphs work. If this was a written language, the message would be lost with the people who disappeared underground. But the symbolism can be mysterious because at the top we have these so-called handbags that are carried by the gods in multitudes of glyphs all over the world. This seems to hint at a higher power of some sort that sent this epoch of death and rebirth according to its own agenda. Some of the pillars show signs of being knocked over and then hastily put back up without being carefully and permanently fixed like the other stones. This seems to indicate that there was a catastrophe going on literally during the intentional burying of this site. And like they say in forensics, we see signs of a struggle. Roughly speaking here, when you put it all out on the table, it looks like there was a catastrophic event that caused the Ice Age, and then civilizations built and maintained these structures to represent that as an occurrence to be remembered, and for good reason. Then another plasmatic catastrophe thousands of years later melted all of that pent-up ice, causing the global flood of all religions, at which point it was game over, and the fantastic attempt was made to preserve this knowledge. Now, this is hypothesis and doesn't exclude the usage of Göbekli Tepe for other activities, and it is silly to think that way. We tend to think of others, especially ancients, as narrow-minded and simple. This site, like the pyramids of Giza, may have had many different purposes. Hell, we do that with our modern sacred sites. The Starbucks, where you got that mocha al Pacino, doubles as an office for people to write emails. The local Walmart doubles as a trailer park cage match for fist fights and is a perfect runway for pajama models to show off their not-so-discreet fashions down the catwalk of the alcohol aisle.
Yeah, we're gonna cut that.
So why plasma and solar flares instead of a comet, as we once very recently thought? Well, there is no crater large enough to account for a global reset. And in the book Forgotten Civilization, Robert shocks us with at least 7 verifiable cases of drastic solar activity in more recent times, as well as insists several times that his wife co-wrote the book. Frankly, enough times to seem like the archaeological equivalent of a joint Facebook account. I'm obviously kidding and probably out of sheer jealousy. I mean, she is smoking hot. And Rob is kind of a goober. The evidence comes to us mostly in the form of dendrochronology, which is the study of tree rings and how the inside of a tree can tell a story of 1,000 years, as well as a close look at ice core samples. Throughout the book, he makes the case that our modern systems of communication and power is too frail to handle one of these solar outbursts, and that we need to start paying attention to these ancient warnings. I mean, we have the equivalent of thousands of ancient voices speaking in unison through these glyphs, all saying the same thing, that the cosmos is not as stable as it seems. If one of these was to hit today, there would be nowhere to run. There would be mass chaos with no electricity, no way to speak to others at a distance, food shortages, and no running water, and even worse yet, a solar outburst like this might even affect my YouTube numbers. So we certainly have built our entire society on a house of cards. To illustrate how frail human life on Earth can be, even without dependence on electrical technology, let's go back 70,000 years to the Toba catastrophe, where the Homo sapien population dropped to roughly a couple thousand people. Had this been any worse at all, there would be a completely different dominant species of humanoid in charge here today, and thus a completely different world. And this number is not to be confused with gradual population growth, because the population bottleneck here resembles an hourglass in shape when you graph it out as population being equal to width and the time moving from top to bottom. You see the chart, I'll shut up. In one of the most recent solar events in the year 1052, the Scottish Chronicles recorded this account. A tower of fire seen at St. George during the space of 5 hours, blackbirds innumerable going into and out of it, and one large bird in the middle of it. This certainly seems to indicate a solar outburst, but even more interesting is the description of these birds. If we look at the figures modeled by Dr. Parrott, we could easily make the connection to the unusual plasma patterns that happen with high velocity particle impact on our magnetic field. It is worth noting that blackbirds of all sorts have been considered an omen of violent or sudden transformation in the mythology of that area. Göbekli Tepe is brimming with mysterious lore, zodiacal representations, therianthropes, and anthropomorphic anthropomorphic depictions, signs of disaster, precision stone reliefs of birds bringing death from above, underground safe places, and so on. A list that reminds us a lot of the most remote location on Earth, a place that certainly must have had no connections with these other locations that depict this mortal theme. A location called Easter Island. The navel of the world is called an emblem of ancient mysteries by Robert Schoch. Easter Island is over 1,500 miles away from any other bit of land. It was discovered on Easter Sunday, 1722. And you can imagine how boggled these seamen were when they saw the giant stone faces keeping watch over the island. These moai are about 10 meters tall and weigh up to 75 tons. You might have recently seen a project on TV where people were moving a replica of one of these moai by rocking it back and forth with ropes. Very cool, if you ask me, and a great theory. But what was not addressed on that show was that they were moving a replica made of lighter and more cavernous volcanic rock. The original moai on the island were finely detailed out of hard basalt and were not volcanic tuft. This walking of the moai was unfortunately meant to deceive, and it generated a lot of money. The hard basalt stone throws a wrench into a couple items here. Why did they use it? Basalt is too heavy to do that with, sure, but why carve into it instead of lava rock? Basalt is harder than steel. What stone carving tools were used that outlasted the hardest stone that there was? What makes this fascinating is that the island is indeed rich in volcanic tuft, but the hard and heavy basalt that the original moai was quarried from, we don't know a location from. A spot to get these giant stones has never been found. To put that into perspective, Stonehenge was quarried from hundreds of miles away in Wales. Wales, the place, not to be confused with the mammal fish, to be clear if Sean is watching. Moving these giant stones quarried from that far away is a real mystery with Stonehenge. But on Easter Island, we don't even have a location to go off of. And don't go telling me that they float. And yes, the basalt quarries might just be under sea level now, but this creates another mystery. If they are under the water, that dates the original moai to extreme antiquity due to the ocean levels rising at the end of the Younger Dryas era, making it as old as Göbekli Tepe. To clarify for the comment section experts out there, yes, there are volcanic quarries on Easter Island, and moai have been made from those. We can see that. But the original moai did not come from those. Much like we see in Egypt, a later yet still ancient people were attempting to replicate the OG structures of a much heavier stone. Another example of less skill over time and not the expected opposite. Okay, the moai were buried up to their neck a very long time ago, and this reminds us of Göbekli Tepe. It has been hypothesized that the sediment drifting down naturally buried these stone figures, but Robert Schoch argues that a mudflow or a landslide would have knocked these tall guys over, or at least tilted them a bit, and as we can see, they are perfectly plumb. And speaking of them being buried up to their necks, this part is a lot of fun, that notion, because for the longest time, all we could see was the heads. It was an internet theory that they had bodies, and this was obviously ridiculous and was not taken seriously, so it transformed into a sort of viral meme joke, and those were a lot of fun too. But how ironically, almost comically strange it was when they started digging down and found out that, just like about everything else, we were only seeing the tip of the iceberg, because all the important work on the moai was in glyphs right there on the backs of these tall guys. And unbelievably so, buried and preserved for us to see today. That messenger pigeon made it all the way to us thousands of years later. And what did this carrier pigeon bring us? Well, the same glyphs that are found in Göbekli Tepe. Come on, let's take a little tour. First of all, the Moai are predominantly male, with only few female characteristics. This reminds us of the very phallic Göbekli Tepe, where the only female depiction is just, not pleasant. But, of course, beautiful in its own way. Robert Schoch describes many low-to-the-ground and thick-walled stone structures that appear to be constructed as if they were made to withstand a direct hit from a powerful aerial bomb. It seems as if the inhabitants needed these shelters for intervals or periods of time. Robert calls these vitrified forts. And why vitrified? Well, vitrification is what happens when stone is heated to such a degree that it transforms down to the molecular level into a kind of glass. It just so happens that many of these heavy roofing stones used for these very forts are in fact vitrified on the top. This is mostly known to occur from very powerful lightning strikes. A lot of this has sparked debate as to ancient usage of nuclear weapons as depicted in super ancient Hindu texts like the Mahabharata. But with this new science concerning plasma blasts from space, perhaps we have a double lead in both directions here. This is, of course, speculation, but the stones themselves don't lie. And, of course, we have the underground cities in Turkey near Göbekli Tepe. There was something very dangerous in the sky for a long time. These underground cities were not just a hole in the wall either. To quote Robert Schoch, over 200 underground complexes are reported in Turkey. Most have not been adequately explored. To this day, nobody really knows the true extent of these or the underground cities of the area, but they were substantial. Göbekli consists of at least 8 floors or underground stories, only 4 of which are currently accessible, each extending in a labyrinth manner over a vast area. The city may have supported a population of 3,000 to 4,000 people, plus farm animals and supplies, all housed underground. Derinkuyu, with an estimated 20 floors and extending an estimated 85 meters below the surface, may have supported anywhere from a few thousand to 10,000 people, plus their livestock and goods. The underground cities may not have been entirely isolated from one another. Göbekli and Derinkuyu are less than a dozen kilometers from each other, and there are reports of a tunnel that may have connected them. There were storage areas, wineries, kitchens, dining rooms, bedrooms, schools, and churches complete with naves, altars, and seating platforms for the congregations. They might be living even finer than we are now here in this Great Depression. Speaking of death from the sky, we have matching petroglyphs of the same birds in both locations, strikingly similar in their comparison to the zodiac symbols of each. Keep in mind what we learned about plasma in the beginning of this video as we look at these matching glyphs and pillars of both locations. Here we are looking at Pillar 18, Enclosure D at Göbekli Tepe. We have the cunning fox and the interesting shape of the thin arms and placement of the hands. But the most lingual of it seems to be the belt. We have what looks like a capital H surrounded by crescent-looking half circles. Where the belt buckle would be, there are more inverted H's with a bowl shape in the middle, and then 3 fingers drooping down from the center, with the middle one being the longest. It is important to keep in mind not to paint our own psyche onto these messages in stone. This is not literally an H, and that is not a belt buckle. We have to look at this from a brand new point of view with fresh eyes, and sometimes that takes a little bit of effort. It's probably not helping that I called them that. But anyway, on the back of this moai at Easter Island, we also have what seems to look like a belt with 3 fingers drooping from the center, and the middle one is the longest. The hand placement is also the same, and staying on this same stonework, we see petroglyphs of birds and symbols that directly match those of Pillar 43 at Göbekli Tepe. This strange H shape was also found in various ancient sites all around the world, and indeed was just as important as the bird-like depictions of the zodiac, most notably in Pumapunku on the same site as the ominous Gate of the Sun, a gate of which is of the sun. Taking all of this in, I'm just gonna show this on the screen here, some illustrations from Robert Schoch's book directly to you. And doing so, I might as well add that I'm not paid or sponsored to talk about this book. I might make $1 if you use my link to buy it though. And each video has a book link or 2 in the description. I will say that this is easily one of the best units that I have read concerning the ancient mysteries, but it also talks about something else that I find to be fascinating, which is how the plasma might be in communication with human DNA through ELF radiation, but that'll be for a different video soon. A plasma apocalypse, powerful enough to reset the Earth and send the course of human beings down a completely different path. A path that it might be consciously choosing, yet a disaster to us, making it quite suit that the human word disaster can be broken down into its original segments as diseased star. But what can we learn from the nature of plasma, besides the fact that we should better secure our own electrical communication systems, which should be obvious by now? Well, personally, I feel a sense of zen instead of fear. Let me explain. It seems that every religion talks about, in the beginning, the waters of the above mixing with the waters of the below to create what is and can be. And we know that plasma, although not a liquid, is still a fluid. This can easily be called the primordial waters of chaos by ancient people who did not have the scientific word fourth state of matter and plasma. And to be frank, their ancient descriptions are probably more easy to absorb considering the deeply symbolic richness that illustrates the mystery instead of making us bust out a dictionary. Plasma is a fluid. Water is a fluid. Both retain great deals of information on a level even more micro than DNA. They have memory, and where we have memory, we also have a form of sentience. Water flows and gives life to all things, yet it also does nothing. Plasma flows and destroys life, yet it also does nothing. Through this ebb and flow, we can learn the way of Zen. We can force our desires all we want, but in the end, we die anyway. But if we are a fluid, like a cat, we can also do nothing, yet unbelievably so, at the same time, leave nothing undone.